In May of 1981, a farmer named Martin Kessler backed a flatbed wagon into the northwest corner of his bean ground outside of Clarence, Missouri. On that wagon were 15 painted hive boxes. Not tractors, not seed, not fertilizer. 15 boxes of bees. By sundown, Martin had lined them along a strip of wild clover beside the road ditch. By breakfast the next morning, his neighbor Roy Pritchard was at the fence, boots in the grass, jaw locked tight. "Martin, you just parked 15 boxes of stinging trouble 60 yards from my wife's clothesline." Martin kept one hand on the fence post. "They'll work the clover first, then the beans." Roy pointed toward his house. "They'll work my porch. They'll work my garden. My granddaughter won't walk to the mailbox if she sees one honeybee on a thistle." "They don't want your granddaughter," Roy snapped back. "They don't ask permission." That was the sentence Roy carried into the county office 3 days later. He filed a nuisance petition asking the commissioners to force Martin to remove the hives from the road ditch and forbid him from keeping bees within a quarter-mile of the Pritchard property. By Friday, every coffee counter in Clarence had already tried the case. A grain farmer with bees. That was the joke. Martin ran 184 acres of corn, beans, and hay with a faded red tractor that had been built before half the men laughing at him were born. Roy ran 530 acres with newer equipment, clean rows, and a chemical bill big enough to make the co-op manager smile. On paper, Roy looked like the future. Martin looked like a man dragging an old habit behind him. But those 15 hives were not an old habit. They were the part of the farm that knew more than the men at the coffee counter did. Martin had inherited them from his father, Elias Kessler, and Elias had learned their value before anyone in that county was ready to believe it. Elias began noticing the change in the late 1950s. Before that, the Kessler farm had a sound in July. Not a machine sound, not a wind sound. A small, constant working sound in the flowers along the pasture fence, in the alfalfa, in the sweet clover near the lane, and in the hollow trees along Crooked Creek. Then the county got cleaner. That was the word everybody used. Cleaner fields, cleaner fence rows, cleaner ditches, cleaner barns, cleaner beans. Sprays did what they were sold to do. The broadleaf weeds curled. The beetles disappeared. The ragweed burned yellow. The roadsides looked tidy enough to photograph for an advertisement. And the farm went quiet. Elias noticed the silence first. Then he noticed the pods. His soybean fields still bloomed. The plants still looked healthy from the road. The stand looked even. The leaves were dark, and any man driving by at 30 miles an hour would have said the crop was fine. But Elias did not read a field from the road. He walked it. He split plants open with his thumbnail. He counted pods. He counted beans per pod. He weighed buckets from different corners of the same field. And by 1961, He had a problem nobody else wanted to see. His beans were setting less crop, not failing, not dying, just leaving money in the flour. The county agent told him soybeans pollinated themselves. The seed salesman told him bees were for orchard men and clover men, not bean men. The chemical salesman told him the missing insects were proof that modern farming was finally working. Elias wrote all three opinions in a notebook. Then he wrote the number that mattered underneath them. 21 bushels per acre. That was what his South bean field had made in 1961. 10 years earlier, that same field had made close to 29. Same ground, same rotation, same family, same rain, more or less. The difference was what no one could see from the road. The flowers were no longer being visited. Soybeans can pollinate themselves. That part was true. But Elias had learned there was a difference between a crop that could finish the job alone and a crop that finished it well. A bee did not just land on a flower. It shook it. It disturbed it. It carried pollen where the plant did not always carry it for itself. It made the flower keep more of what it had already started. Elias had a phrase for that. "The field keeps a second ledger," he told Martin. "The first one is what you buy: seed, fuel, iron, spray. The second one is what the land pays you back because you kept it alive enough to work." In 1963, Elias bought 5 hives from an old beekeeper outside Moberly. He put them near the clover strip because the morning sun hit there first, and the wind broke behind the hay shed. The first year, the south field came back to 27 bushels. The second year, 29. By 1967, Elias was cutting 31 to 33 bushels on ground the county average said should be making 25. He did not brag about it. Quiet men rarely brag when the thing they know sounds foolish to everybody else. He just kept the bees alive, kept the fence rows blooming, and kept the notebook. Martin learned the hives the way other boys learned cattle. He learned how to light a smoker without choking the colony. He learned how to find a queen by watching how the workers made space around her. He learned that fear made hands jerky, and jerky hands made bees defensive. Elias never told him the bees were pets. He called them labor. "Don't romanticize them," he said. "They work. Respect work." When Elias died in 1972, Martin inherited the farm, the tractor, the notebooks, and 9 surviving hives. By 1981, he had 15, and Roy Pritchard wanted the county to make him haul them away. The hearing was held in the basement room of the county courthouse on a humid Thursday afternoon. Roy came with his wife Mabel and 2 neighbors who had signed the petition. Mabel had been stung while pulling towels from the line. She did not exaggerate it. Her wrist had swollen. It had hurt. She had every right to be angry. Roy's argument was simple. Bees crossed property lines. The Pritchard house sat too close to the clover strip. A farm should not create a hazard for a neighbor's family. If Martin wanted bees, he could keep them somewhere else. For the first 10 minutes, the room belonged to Roy. Then Martin opened a cardboard folder and took out his father's notebooks. The room changed before he said a word, because men who laughed at bees did not laugh at records. Martin laid out 18 years of field notes, his father's and his own, handwritten yield figures, hive counts, bloom dates, rainfall marks, field maps, harvest tickets, and little pencil lines dividing the bean ground by distance from the hives. Martin had not simply kept bees. He had measured them. He showed the commissioners 3 zones. The near zone sat within 400 yards of the hives. The middle zone stretched from 400 to 900 yards. The far zone lay beyond that, where bee traffic thinned until it became hard to see. For 7 seasons under Martin's management, he had kept those harvests separate. Near zone, 33.6 bushels per acre. Middle zone, 29.1. Far zone, 25.8. The county average during those years was 25.2. The room stopped moving. Martin turned one page and put the math in plain language. On the land closest to the hives, his beans were running more than 8 bushels above the ground that saw almost no bees. Across his 118 acres of soybeans, the pollination difference was worth roughly 900 extra bushels in a good year. At that spring's cash price, it was a little over $5,000. The hives cost him less than $300 a year to maintain. One of the commissioners leaned forward. "You're saying the bees pay better than a new planter?" Martin looked at the men in the room. "I'm saying a new planter won't make a flower set seed if nothing visits the flower." Roy folded his arms. "My wife still got stung." Martin nodded. "She did. And I'll move the hives farther off the road and plant a taller screen between the ditch and your house. But if the question is whether these bees are useless trouble, the numbers say they are some of the most useful workers on either farm." Then he said the part Roy hated most. "Some of them are working your beans, too." Roy looked as if the sentence had landed harder than an accusation. The commissioners denied the petition. They did not give Martin everything. They ordered the hives moved back from the road ditch and required a hedgerow screen before the next bloom. But they refused to ban the bees. Roy left that room angry. Martin left with his hives, and Clarence left with a number it could not forget. 8 bushels. That was the number that traveled faster than the bees ever could. By the end of summer, 3 farmers had asked Martin where to buy hives. By fall, the co-op manager had quit laughing and started asking questions he should have asked years earlier. Martin did not sell the idea like a salesman. He showed men what Elias had shown him. Keep flowers somewhere on the farm. Do not spray during bloom. Put hives where morning sun can wake them and wind cannot punish them. Do not starve the bees and then expect them to feed the crop. Most men heard the last part as poetry. Martin meant it as management. The first farms that tried it did not transform overnight. Nothing in farming does, except a hailstorm. But the figures began to lean. A field that had been stuck at 26 made 28. A low corner that always underperformed gained 2 bushels. A farmer who had blamed seed quality found more beans in the pods nearest the clover. The change was small enough to dismiss one year, and too consistent to dismiss by the third. By 1985, 9 farms around Clarence had managed hives. By 1987, there were 17. The county extension office still did not know what to do with the pattern. Improved seed explained some of it. Weather explained some of it. Better weed control explained some of it. But none of those explained why the strongest gains clustered near farms where bees had been reintroduced and insecticide had been pulled away from bloom. A young extension agent named Paul Hennessy finally visited Martin after harvest in 1987. Paul was careful, the way educated men are careful when they suspect a farmer may be right before the literature is ready. He asked for the notebooks. Martin gave him a kitchen table, black coffee, and 2 cardboard boxes of records. Paul spent 6 hours at that table. He mapped hive locations against yield changes. He compared fields inside heavy foraging range against similar fields outside it. He marked weather years. He marked variety changes. He marked soil types. At the end, he closed the last notebook and looked almost embarrassed. "You've been running a trial without calling it one." Martin shook his head. "My father was trying to keep a farm solvent." Paul published a small regional extension note the following spring. It did not make dramatic claims. It used careful language. It said, "Managed pollinator density appeared to contribute measurable gains to soybean yield in fields where wild pollinator populations had collapsed." Careful language is how institutions admit they are late. 2 years later, the university ran replicated plots in 3 counties. Caged beans with no bee access. Open beans with natural pollinator traffic. Open beans near managed hives. The managed hive plots outperformed the low pollinator plots by a range that made every farmer in the county read the paragraph twice. 12 to 26%, depending on distance, bloom weather, and colony strength. Martin did not celebrate when the report came out. He walked it out to the shed and laid it beside Elias's notebooks. The university had put numbers behind what his father had heard first as silence. But the beans were only half of the story. The other half came in glass jars. Because the Kessler farm had not been managed like the clean farms around it, Elias had left the messy things that modern men liked to scrape away. A hedge of wild plum along the lane, basswood near the creek, clover in the hay, alfalfa in the rotation, goldenrod at the back fence, a tangle of asters nobody could turn into a clean row. The bees worked all of it. Spring honey came pale and bright, with clover and plum in it. Summer honey carried basswood and alfalfa. Fall honey came darker, heavier, almost spicy from goldenrod and late asters. Martin's wife, Ruth, bottled it in squat glass jars and wrote the extraction month on brown paper labels. At first, they sold it from a plank table beside the machine shed. Then, a grocer in Moberly bought 2 cases. Then, a bakery in Columbia wanted the fall honey for biscuits. Then, in 1990, Ruth entered a jar of July basswood honey at the Missouri State Fair. Martin said it was a waste of postage and pride. Ruth said the bees deserved a judge. The honey took first place in its class and reserve champion overall. The judge's note used a phrase Ruth cut out and pinned above the sink. Tastes like a farm with flowers left in it. That phrase became more valuable than any label Martin could have bought. By the next season, every jar was sold before the extractor was washed. And Roy Pritchard, the man who had tried to remove the hives, could not escape the arithmetic. His own soybean yields had refused to move. Roy had done everything the modern program asked him to do. He bought better seed. He widened and narrowed rows. He traded equipment. He followed chemical schedules so closely that the co-op man could almost predict his checkbook. Yet his beans sat under a ceiling. 25, 26, 24 in a bad dry year, 27 if the rain flattered him. In 1990, Roy's beans made 24.7 bushels per acre. Martin's made 34.9. Same county, same summer, not the same field, but close enough to hurt. In November, Roy drove to the Kessler farm without calling ahead. Martin was in the bee yard, wrapping hives for winter and reducing entrances against mice. Roy stayed 10 paces back. He had not been afraid at the hearing, but he was uneasy around the boxes. Martin noticed and set the smoker down. "They're not flying much in this cold." Roy nodded as if he had come to discuss weather. Then he said what had taken him 9 years to say. "I was wrong." Martin did not help him by pretending otherwise. Roy looked toward the hives. "I thought they were a problem because I could see the problem." My wife's wrist swelled up. My granddaughter cried. There it was, right in front of me. I never counted what I couldn't see. Martin answered quietly, "That's most of farmin'." Roy pulled a folded elevator ticket from his coat. 24.7. You? 34.9. Roy stared at the paper. I farm almost 3 times your acres. I have newer machines. I spend more on inputs before planting than you spend on that whole bee yard in a decade. And your little boxes are beating my iron. Martin shook his head. The boxes are not beating your iron. Your flowers are underworked. That line stayed between them longer than either man expected. Roy finally asked the question that changed his farm. How many hives would it take? Martin did not smile. For your acres, you start with 6 if you want to learn without making a mess. Then 10 or 12 once you know what you're doing. And you stop spraying insecticide while the beans are in bloom. Roy frowned. That is 3 weeks. That is the 3 weeks the crop is asking for help. What about pests? You scout. You do not spray a calendar. You spray a problem. It sounded simple. It was not. For Roy, it meant admitting that some of his confidence had been rented from people who sold him things. It meant telling the co-op he was skipping a bloom application. It meant handling the same kind of bees he had once described as a trespass. That winter, Roy bought 6 hives through Martin. Martin helped place them on a south-facing rise behind the machine shed, away from the house, close enough to reach the beans, sheltered from the north wind. Roy's grandson Dale was the one who took to them. He learned fast, faster than Roy. Children often do when adults have too much pride to unlearn first. The following harvest, Roy's soybean yield climbed to 30.8. 6 bushels in 1 year. Not every acre gained equally. Not every field responded the same. But the farm changed enough that Roy brought the elevator ticket to Martin before he took it home. He did not say thank you first. He just handed over the paper. Martin read it, then handed it back. Roy cleared his throat. I skipped the bloom spray. I know. Saved me $1,400. I know. Roy looked at him. You don't know everything. Martin almost smiled. No. But bees dying in July tell on a man. By then, the old argument had become county history. Not because the sting had never mattered. It had. Mabel's pain was real. Her fear was real. The inconvenience was real. Martin never mocked it, and that mattered too. He moved the hives. He planted the screen. He kept a clean water pan for the bees so they would not crowd a neighbor's bird bath in dry weather. The lesson was never that nuisance was imaginary. The lesson was that nuisance was not the whole ledger. One swollen wrist had been visible. 1,000 extra bushels had not. The visible thing got a petition. The invisible thing paid the mortgage. The man most humbled by the bees may not have been Roy. It may have been Glenn Arnett, the machinery dealer in town. Glenn had mocked Martin longer than anyone. He sold planters, sprayers, cultivators, combines, augers, parts, belts, bearings, and every steel answer a farmer could finance. He liked equipment because equipment stood still when you looked at it. You could point to it. You could polish it. You could put it on a lot with flags and make a man believe progress had a paint color. Bees offended Glenn's sense of order. They were not bought on credit. They did not depreciate properly. They could not be lined up in front of a showroom. In 1992, after the university study had been cited in 3 farm papers, and after half the county had either bought hives or stopped spraying during bloom, Glenn drove to Martin's farm. He found Ruth stacking honey jars into cardboard flats. Glenn picked up one jar and held it to the window. Dark gold. "You know what this is doing to me?" he asked. Ruth wiped her hands on a towel. "Making you breakfast?" Glenn shook his head. "Making me rethink what counts as equipment." Martin came in from the shed, and Glenn laid out the numbers he had been avoiding. By the early 1990s, the farms around Clarence were gaining enough soybean production from pollination that the added grain value across the local trade area approached hundreds of thousands of dollars in good years. Not from a new line of tractors, from hives, from wild edges, from 3 weeks of restraint during bloom. Glenn looked almost wounded by it. "I have sold men $60,000 machines that did not return what 6 hive boxes returned on Roy Pritchard's farm last year." Martin set a jar into a flat. "That does not make machines useless. No, it makes them not enough." That winter, Glenn cleared a corner of his showroom and stocked veils, frames, smokers, hive tools, and plain wooden boxes. Farmers laughed for one morning. Then they bought them. By 1998, the county no longer treated bees like an eccentric accessory. They were still not on every farm. They did not solve every problem. They did not make poor soil rich or bad management wise. But they had changed the way men talked about yield. A soybean plant could be self-pollinating and still benefit from help. A ditch could look messy and still feed a crop. A 3-week spray break could look risky and still protect more value than it cost. A small living system could return more than a large financed machine. That was the humiliation hidden inside the honey. Martin had not discovered magic. He had remembered dependence. Roy expanded from 6 hives to 14. Dale eventually took over the bee work and became the person other farmers called when a colony went queenless or a swarm hung from a fence post. Mabel, who had once wanted the hives gone, began planting zinnias and borage behind the house, because she liked seeing bees in the garden as long as they had a reason to stay there. She still did not like being stung. She also did not confuse a sting with the whole truth anymore. Ruth's honey won 2 more state ribbons, one for spring clover plum, one for fall goldenrod. The fall jar was the one people remembered. It was darker than grocery honey, rougher and more complicated. The judge said it carried the flavor of late fields after heat had done its work. Ruth said that was the nicest way anyone had ever described weeds. Martin never expanded the hives beyond what the farm could feed. That was another lesson Elias had left him. A man could overstock bees the same way he could overstock cattle. The point was not to force more boxes onto the land. The point was to build a farm that could support the workers it needed. By the time Martin turned the operation over to his daughter Claire in 2005, the Kessler farm ran 24 hives, 184 acres, no insecticide during bloom, and more flowering edges than some men thought respectable. The old tractor still started if you knew how to speak to it. The notebooks were stored in the house in plastic tubs. Elias's first bee receipt, 5 hives in 1963, was framed in the kitchen beside Ruth's State Fair ribbon. Claire added digital records, but she did not throw away the notebooks. She said the old pages understood the farm before the spreadsheets did. And every July, when the beans flowered, the farm made that old sound again. Small, constant, easy to ignore if you had trained yourself to only hear engines. Roy Pritchard died before he could become a sentimental man, but in his last years he kept one note taped above the parts bench in his shop. It was not a Bible verse. It was not a yield goal. It was not a price chart. It was a sentence Martin had said the day Roy finally asked for help. "Your flowers are underworked." That was the line that changed him, because it named the real problem without flattering anybody. The crop was not lazy. The land was not failing. The new equipment was not evil. The chemicals were not always wrong. But the system had been made too quiet. The farm had removed workers it did not know how to value, then wondered why the work was not getting done. Roy had seen 15 hive boxes and thought they were crossing a boundary. He was right about the crossing. He was wrong about the boundary. The bees crossed fences because the farm itself was never divided as neatly as the deed made it look. Flowers did not care who paid taxes on the dirt beneath them. Pollen did not stop at survey stakes. A soybean blossom did not ask whether the insect landing on it came from a neighbor's hive. For years, Roy counted the sting. Martin counted the harvest. And in the end, the harvest told the fuller truth. The nuisance was not the bees. The nuisance was the silence left behind when the bees were gone.